Okay, I have no idea what I'm doing. Just decided to invite all of you because I thought this would be fun to talk about the economy and human behavior and all of it. I don't know how many people are joining. We'll see how it goes. But I would like you guys, Choi, AJ, Joe, and Jeff, to introduce yourselves super quick, and then we'll just start chatting. Figure it out.
I'll go first. My name is Choi Halladay. I have a day job, but at one point in my life, I thought I was going to be an economist, so I ended up getting a PhD in economics, and that's become pretty useless for me in my real life. But every once in a while, I get to dust off some of those skills and chat. So I'm looking forward to this.
And AJ.
Sure. I'm AJ Barnett. I'm an attorney in Southwest Portland, and I represent a number of people involved here. So I got asked to be involved in this just because I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people recently about everything that's going on, and economics is like a hobby to me. I love economics. So yeah, it's my favorite useless hobby too.
And Joe Squires.
Hi. Everybody, I'm Joe Squires. I own an electrical contracting company here, and my minor in college was a useless American history with a focus on the Revolutionary War. So I dig the AJ and I have really good conversations about why we think James Madison is cool.
And Jeff Kreisler. Oh, you're on mute. Blah, blah, blah.
Boom. Hi, technology. I'll give you the relevant stuff. I run a website called People Science, which is all about behavioral economics, which is, for those who don't know, the combination of traditional economics with basic human psychology, like why we make decisions as we do. And I run that all about everything in the modern marketplace, incentives, engagement, habits, healthcare, finance, and I also wrote a book called Dollars and Cents, which is all about behavioral finance and financial decision making. And I come to this from the world of satire and comedy. My first book was called Get Rich Cheating, which was not a playbook, but has been used by some people. I'm going to assume, since this is Portland based, that we all agree that the president's the guy that I'm talking about. Okay, bye.
What? Wait a minute.
What?
That's me.
Okay, so I want to get started with super basic stuff that I think I don't understand, that I've seen you guys all talk about, that made it make sense to me. And basic level, basic economics. What is the Fed? If you can answer these questions in about a sentence, just what is the Fed? Who are these people?
So the Fed is the central bank of the United States. Every country has some version of a central bank. In Germany, there's the Bundesbank. There's and their roles differ and how they do things differ, but the basic concept is they're the sort of master of the currency of the country. They're the ones who decides how much currency should be around and those kinds of things.
Stupid question. I'm good at
There are no stupid questions.
Thanks, Teach. Fort Knox. Like, what is that? Is that a fad?
Mm-hmm. No.
See, stupid. Told you.
So, the more basic question is what is money? And before we talk about banks, you got to actually talk about what is money. And over time, there's been two kinds, roughly, basically two broad categories of money. So money is it's a thing we use to represent value, right? It's just a tool to represent value. And the two big categories of that kind of value representation has been the system we use now, which is called fiat currency, which we'll get to in a second. And then before there was fiat currency, there was actually what would be considered commodity-backed currency. So in the old days, a piece of paper that said, $1 gold note represented whatever quarter of an ounce of gold that was stored somewhere, because the gold itself would be kind of a pain in the ass to, drag around with you. So the piece of paper actually represented what that, and if a bank wanted to create more of those notes, they would have to haul away more of the gold, right? That is not how our system works today.
Well, at some point we disconnected from gold as being a measured currency, right?
Yeah.
In the
So I mean, these commodity-based currencies, there's just really crazy versions of them that have existed over time, even in the United States. So before central banking kind of became its thing, states issued notes and currency and money, and one of my favorites is the nascent territory of Utah did commodity-based currency back in the 1800s, when people were like dragging themselves across country to form Utah. That was livestock based. It was like, this note is worth 3 hooves and a antler or something, And
Troy, didn't we go off the gold base at one point? That's where Fort Knox, the reserve, was.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fiat currency.
Nixon, who pulled us off the silver back.
So actually, there have been a slow transition away from commodity-based, pretty much from the beginning of the Fed, which was in the 19-teens, because the banking system had just gotten so complicated that the notion of tracking gold or silver or anything else to the value of notes, and actually World War II kind of completely killed it off, even though we pretended for a long time.
So we can think of the Fed as Joe's background, the people in Game of Thrones, a separate entity. But who are they? Could I join the Fed? How do you become part of the Fed?
The Fed is an actual bank, like any other bank, believe it or not. The weirdness is that they don't have customers like you and me. Their customers are other banks, right? So they're the banks the commercial banks that you and I think of as, US Bank or Wells Fargo or whatever. It's the bank that those banks use. The Fed also has regulatory power, but I mean, among many organizations, has regulatory power over banks. So there's probably 9, 10, 11, 12 different federal organizations that have some sort of regulatory power over banks, some of which you may have heard of, like the Fed, some of which you probably have never heard of, like the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency. There's just tons and tons of organizations. But the basic thing about the Fed is that they are a private bank that is owned by the shareholders of the banks, and it's a system of banks. It's actually 13 of them. The shareholders of the banks are the actual commercial banks, so they all own stakes in the Fed. But in order to become like a board member, you actually have to get congressional approval.
So you have to first be part of one of, 13 banks? Wells
Fargo,
so you have to
be.
Or...
Yeah. So there's all the different Federal Reserve banks are named after the city in which they're headquartered. So there's a Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. There's a Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Right.
If you look on your dollar bills where most of them are printed, it's like San Francisco is L and New York is B, Boston is A.
There are actual codes on your paper currency that tells you which of the banks actually print it.
Then there's 2 banks that print coins. What is it? Troy, Philadelphia and Denver?
Denver, yeah. So whatever the code is
got there?
in that little
What
little
was
shield.
that, Jeff? What number was it?
Daniel's got an L.
Most of the ones we see on the West Coast are L's.
L, yeah.
That's
You hippies.
Yeah,
You
the
hippies.
closest.
Okay, so
it's like an L because it's like a joint.
Yeah.
To have
But
a
anyway,
voice, you have to be part of the one of their approved banks and then make friends with Congress.
Yeah. Well, so then you get nominated and then you get to be on. Each of those 13 then has a member that goes to the central overall Federal Reserve Governing Board. And those are the folks that make these large scale decisions over, in essence, I mean, there's all sorts of fancy stuff behind it, but basically what they're saying is this is how much currency there should be in the United States.
So speaking of that, we have, what's the trillion, $2 trillion?
$2 trillion that they just,
a stimulus package.
Yeah,
so
the stimulus package.
What?
Yeah, so they've actually done a number of things even above the $2 trillion. So if you go back a few weeks, the very first thing that happened was that the Fed actually did something pretty innocuous, which was they decided, well, we're worried about growth of the economy. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our standard playbook, like if you're a fan of a favorite football team and they have kind of a go-to play that they always do, right? That's kind of what the Fed did a few weeks ago. They said, okay, we're going to just lower some interest rates, right? And, because that'll help stimulate the economy a little bit. Things are cool, right? And there was a question on your sheet about, well, why does that work? Well, the reason it's supposed to work is because with interest rates a little bit lower than any of the kinds of investments where a company is on the fence about borrowing money in order to, let's say, build a new factory or whatever, it wouldn't pencil out at 5%, but it really does pencil out at 4% interest, then they're going to do that, right? They're going to say, oh, yeah, let me borrow the money, spend it, and build this factory. And by building the factory, you have to hire people to build it. You have to, do all these other hire, or buy equipment to put into it, all that kind of stuff. And so that just creates more economic activity. So
when the government says, hey, there's all of a sudden, poof, $2 trillion, I think a lot of us are thinking, how the hell does this money come out of nowhere?
Okay.
And what are the implications
Well,
of that?
let me tell you how that happens.
Joe.
Let me tell you how that happens. That was like the third or fourth step along the way under all of this COVID stuff, but it's the one that made the biggest news splash. So here's what Congress does. Congress says, look, we want to spend a bunch of money, right? And like most things in Congress right now, they don't have a bunch of money because we've been deficit spending for decades. So they go, hey, we just want to spend all this money. The only way they can do that is they have to borrow it from somewhere, right? And the way that the federal government borrows money is they sell bonds. And so bonds are IOUs, right? They're just gigantic IOUs that the federal government issues that says, hey, if anybody wants to buy this bond, we will pay you 20 years from now a certain amount, or 10 years from now a certain amount. It's more than what you're giving us now, right? So we'll give you interest plus whatever this the face value of the bond is, and they sell them in huge denominations, right? They're not. This isn't you and me going to the store or going to U.S. Bank and getting a $10,000 credit card. This is we need $100 million. If you want in on this, you're going to buy $100 million.
My grandma got me one of those for my bar mitzvah.
Yeah. Well, there's other
I made
versions,
$7 on it,
bonds, which is a little bit different, and they sell those. But these big scale bonds are these gigantic bonds. Okay, so now the question it becomes: so somebody has to buy them, which means that they're going to give money to the government, right? And then the government can then turn around and spend that money. Well, who buys those? Well, some are investment kinds of things where you and I can buy a portion, like we can go into a condo association basically to buy a bond, right? Where we all share in the cost of this bond, and we all take care of it together. But in reality, when you decide you're going to sell $2 trillion worth of bonds. No little mom and pop or even large scale hedge fund or anything else has that kind of money sitting around. And so who buys it is the Fed. The Fed is a gigantic bank. They have lots of reserve, but they have one thing that is even better than reserve, which is they have the legal authority to just print money.
So what happens when we miraculously come up with what seems miraculously come up with $2 trillion?
So let's assume that when the federal government said, hey, we want to sell these $2 trillion in bonds to do the stimulus package, that there were no private buyers at all. Just, I don't know whether that's true, but let's just assume it was true, right? So that means the Fed has to come up with all of it. And so what the Fed will do is because they have that legal authority, they basically print money. Well, not, that's figurative, but they create money and toss it over to the federal government to say, here you go, give us those IOUs. We'll hold them for you. And you now magically have $2 extra trillion that you can spend. So what are the ramifications of that? Well, those pieces of paper are just like any other item in the economy. The more of them there are, the less they're worth, right? I mean, that's just how it works. The more of them they're floating around, the less they're worth. And so you pay for those, all of us pay for those over time through inflation and through lots of other things, including like just
debt service.
We're borrowing from the future, right? Because at some point, those IOUs come due, right? And the federal government has to actually make good on them. And so what do they do to do that? Well, they can refinance them, basically. They can just say, well, we're going to issue even more bonds to pay off those bonds.
Is any of this real?
It's real.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in because we've used so many terms here. We've used so much lingo. I'm starting to get bored, and I know what they all mean. So I want to go back to something that Choi said, which was supply and demand. The more abundant something is, the less it's worth, because that is something that we all kind of say, yeah, we understand that that's true, but that's the driving principle here, is that money is only valuable because we all agreed it's valuable. But we didn't ever all agree on exactly what it would be worth relative to everything else. We didn't all agree on what is a loaf of bread worth. We didn't all agree on what is a gallon of gas worth. We didn't all agree on the cost of wood and steel and sand and glass or gold, except as it applies to money. So we all can say, okay, $1 to me is the same as $1 to you, but those other things don't all have fixed values. So why is that important? Let me try to make this relevant. Is the price of everything is always fluctuating based on if people want it. For example, look at a jersey of the most popular athlete, right? You can go on eBay and it's very expensive, but when that athlete switches teams or retires or is involved in a domestic violence scandal, that jersey is worth garbage all of a sudden because everyone agrees it's worth garbage. So all things, their value is just as flexible as that jersey. Their value is only important when keto diet came out, everything with carbs in it became less valuable. So, and we don't even know if keto is a good diet or not. It's just information changes the value of everything. And it's a lot harder to see with money because, our paycheck doesn't go up. Every time the Fed issues more money doesn't mean that our paycheck increases. It doesn't mean our mortgage increases. It doesn't mean, you know, we don't even really see the gallon of, we can hear on the news that the price of oil went up, but we don't see that at the gas station right away. So what does it actually mean when the Fed prints all that money? Without getting into debated issues and politics, what that means is over time, everything is going to get more expensive. Every price in the grocery store will eventually increase. It won't increase today. The printing $2 trillion is not going to cause a gallon of milk to go up, but it is going to make a gallon of milk go up eventually. It will make every price of everything in the grocery store, every amount people want to get paid for their labor, every price of a house, every tax, every gallon of gas, every price of a car will eventually go up based on the number of dollars in circulation, because what we all agreed on when we were a much, much, much smaller country is, you know, conceptually, when you have a village, it's really easy to see. If there's only a couple hundred people, we all know how many loaves of bread we need, so how many cows we need as a village, all those kind of things. So when money first came out, it was really easy to look at the dollar and see how that compared to the value of all these things. How much should we, you know, when the first people to set prices in dollars had a much easier time doing it than they do now. And that's why now it takes a long time for inflation is the process of all the prices going up because there's just more money around. If someday I don't think it would ever happen, but if the Fed just decides, you know what, we've printed too much money, we're going to tear up half the dollars. What would eventually happen is the cost of a gallon of milk would go down because there's the same amount of milk and less dollars. So the gallon of milk and the cost of a new Honda Civic, everything would go down. But I hope that helps a little bit, that supply and demand is relative to the number of things out there.
Right. And the more
maybe I
money,
started using too many terms.
The more money we print that we magically create, the less it's worth, essentially. And over time, we see the effects of that in our everyday life for the essentials that we need.
Yep.
And our paychecks. And that's even probably more important than the gallon of milk is we have to be paid more if there's more money out there, because if you think of money, every dollar is a piece of this gigantic pie of all the money. We need a certain amount of pie. We need a certain size of slice to have the life we want. If dollars are smaller, then we need more dollars to make the same amount of pie, because you need a certain amount of pie to eat, to live, I guess.
So this is a question kind of for Jeff. Should we be investing in toilet paper? And just kind of, can you talk us through a little bit about what, you know, with all of this uncertainty going on, why are people hoarding, and what can people be thinking about with how they're managing their own resources and their money?
Yes, I can answer that, but I'd almost like to take a quick step back, building on what AJ was saying about like the potential complexity and a lot of like terms being thrown out. And the reason, broadly speaking, why we make irrational decisions, whether it's hoarding toilet paper, pulling money out of our 401k, investing in pie, cutting devices, whatever it may be, for those of us that aren't like well-versed in the terminology of the Fed, am I echoing, or is it?
It was a little
You're good.
I think you're okay.
Awesome. For those of us that aren't well versed in terminology of what is money and how the Fed and all this works, and even those of us that are, it's a lot to process, right? There's a lot of cognitive work that it takes to think about, oh, more money means inflation's going up, or how the Fed, or what is money, and all of us have a hard time doing that. So when it comes to our actual decisions about money, whether it's should I buy this milk, or should I buy a home, or should I quit my job, or whatever it is with money, we don't think about it in terms of the big complex picture. we try to simplify and find the easy solution. And we often go for the emotionally easy solution, the thing that makes us feel good and makes it so that we can tell ourselves subconsciously, oh, I understand that complex thing. Right? That's why I made this choice. And it's why we fall for sale prices. A sale price, you know, when you see a $100 shirt that's marked down to $60, we tend to buy that more often than we would a $60 shirt because we make this easy emotional feeling, oh, this $60 shirt's better than a $100 shirt. And it's an easy, quick thing, and we don't have to think about it. It's just like these cues to tell us. And that's a very specific example, but it plays into this whole thing. Everything that we've talked about, and AJ and Choi, thank you for leading it, is true. And it's something that we should understand. But when it comes to making our decisions, we're not going to think about all that. We're going to find that easy solution. And that is, broadly speaking, not just why we fall for sale prices and why we might hoard, and I can get more into hoarding, but why we're very prone to any sort of nudge or cue or trap, whether it's intentionally set by someone else, like, hey, these interest rates are great, or it's something we do to ourselves, like falling for sale prices. That's why we fall for these things. That's why we make mistakes, because it feels good. It feels like we're making the right choice. As far as the hoarding thing, it's particularly fascinating, and you know, there's a few things that go in mind. One is something that's called anchoring, which is basically when we see a price or an activity or a decision, we tend to believe that it's the right thing. Anchoring combined with something called social proof. So you might not think, oh, I need to hoard toilet paper, but you suddenly see everybody else doing it. And in your mind, you're like, oh, there's a price, there's a reason why that's happening. And so you're like, I'm going to do what everyone else is doing. In a moment when we are uncertain, and I think that's very true right now, and we don't have all the information, we tend to go with what we see others do, particularly others that are like us. And not just what we see them do, but what we think they're doing. So if all the news stories are about hoarding and about stealing the toilet paper, even if that's not true at our store down the street, we think it is, and therefore we react to it. The other element about hoarding, and then I'll let some other people chime in, is that it's sort of about getting some control. Right now, as always, but even more heightened, like we all have this sense of not having control over our lives, not being clear what's going to happen in a month or 2 months or a year. And in many ways, like just getting toilet paper makes us feel like, okay, well, I've got control of something. And someone who's studied psychology more than I have, so this is a little pop psychology, don't put it down on a test anywhere, is just pooping. I'm training my 3-year-old right now to potty train. Pooping is a big control thing, right? You've got control over your body. And if I can get toilet paper so that I can have control over the one thing that I cannot control, you know, humans have to poop, maybe I can make sense of all of that. So there's a little real science with the anchoring and the social proof and all that. And there's a little pop psychology with poop because.
Well, I enjoy any discussion that equates or links economics with poop.
With
So.
pooping.
Well, I did have Ben Bernanke as an Econ 101 professor. So.
Did you?
Oh, wow. Jeez.
Yeah. Anyway, go on.
Joe, I want to hear a little from you. And one of the things that we got into a discussion on online, what made me think I need to talk to Joe, is I had a question about who we owe when we get into debt. And basically my understanding is from talking to Joe, kind of ourselves. I know Choi touched on it a little bit. And I'm curious, Joe, to hear your perspective and also, so who we owe, and also we'll get into it a little more, but what's going on with business bailouts and how are small businesses different from big businesses and what's too big to fail. But starting with, who do we owe?
That's a lot of questions. I think Troy touched on it. You know, most people, I've heard quite a few people, it's like, well, China owns all of our T-bills or all of our debt. We owe China the money. We'll just tell them to F off and wipe the slate clean, like declaring bankruptcy. And you can't do that because I forget what the number is, but I think it's 70% or more of all treasury bills issued. You know, and what's the debt? What's the debt up to now? 23 trillion, plus we just rattled off another 2.2 trill with probably another 2 trill to go, you know, just trillions of dollars. And I don't know about you guys, as a business owner, debt is crushing. And what's the U.S. budget, like $4 trillion a year? So when you put $4 trillion on your credit card and you've already got 22 trillion on your credit card, I mean, when your debt is equal to when your debt is equal to 7 times a year, 7 times what you gross in a year, you're not digging out of that debt. When the U.S. debt service is like $250 billion a year. It's $1 billion a day. I mean, I think it's like 7% of the U.S. budget goes towards servicing debt. Those are crushing numbers. I mean,
that's 7% of the budget simply to process the debt.
Simply when people cash in their T-bills, because there's 6 month, 12 month, 3 year, 5 years, 7, 10 year. I mean, you can get T-bills in various years, and then the longer you kick the debt, the higher the rate of return is. So if you get a 10-year T-bill, it'll be 7%. So if you bought 1,000, you'd get or whatever it is. I forget what it is. I've actually never bought a T-bill, but I just know that the longer you kick it, the more. But some people redeem them for cash, and some people redeem them and get more. But whenever people redeem these treasury bills, it's to the tune of about $250 billion a year. I mean, and when you're, that's 1/8 of your entire income. I mean, goes to debt service. Like here in Oregon, I mean, you remember they were talking about replacing the I-5 bridge, and it was $1 billion project. And that $1 billion project was, the largest construction project that was going to come to the state, Oregon or Washington state history. It was going to employ 1,000 people for 2 years while you did this and pump so much money into the economy. It's $1 billion. That's a day's worth of interest. I mean, you imagine how good the economy would be doing if the government, instead of doing debt service, could spend $250, $300 billion on infrastructure projects. If each state got, $6 billion a year to spend on replacing water lines and stuff, we'd have zero unemployment. I mean, I don't know. Debt bothers me as a business owner because it's crushing. The equivalent of that is if you make $60,000 a year, let's say you make 75 and you bring home 60. The equivalent of this is having $400,000 in credit card debt. I mean, you're not digging out of it.
It's like going to school in America, going to college.
You bring up a good question. If we default on the loans that are loans to us, from us, if I followed, then who are we defaulting on, and what does the default process look like? Does it look like 2008? That sort of hollowing out of a situation, like Joe, if your business defaults, you have to pay your creditors. But if you are your creditor, are you actually defaulting? Which brings up Jocelyn's question: is this even real? Can you default on something you owe to yourself?
That's a Troy question. That's above my pay. I don't know what happens.
The Apache Nation will reclaim all of our
our land.
We owe it to them anyway.
Before I get to that, I want to just make one point about something Joe stated. You're right. This notion that it drives so many people just crazy that you're quote unquote wasting your money on interest, right? Instead of doing something productive with that money. The one caveat I would make is that there are times when going into debt, even as a small business, does make sense, right? Where you know that, hey, this is an investment I'm making that will actually make me more productive and be able to leverage into the future so that I can grow or do other things. So there are rational times to take on debt, but it's not the same as the rational time is to always add more and more debt constantly, right?
Well, if someone did that as a person, it would almost be like they constantly get in debt until they find more and more banks that would loan to them, and more banks, and then they become in debt to more and more banks until finally they find a nation that has natural resources that's able to just support them for future promises of, I don't know, becoming like a president of the country, and then like sort of making that all collapse so that the entire system based upon the dollar, let's say the dollar,
Choi, you're right. I mean, when I look at my balance sheet on my business, I have what I refer to as good debt. I mean, I've 40 service vans, and I have 5 vehicle loans. Which means our vehicles are pretty new. And if you have if you get GM, like out of all this, GM is going to pop up and say, we'll offer 0% financing for the next 5 years, and I'm going to go out and buy 7 vans, and that facilitates the economy. And that's good debt to me on my balance sheet. Having a line of credit, having a building that I bought, there's good debt, and I'm okay with a certain amount of debt. The United States is that hot chick who's the receptionist at a law firm who, makes $50,000 a year and has $100,000 in credit card debt and 2 cats and drives a Honda Civic. So I mean, we're well past.
If the cats are both tigers, it's a good debt.
Tiger lady.
Good debt. I have this conversation with business owners all the time who ask me whether they should borrow money, and my answer is good debt needs to be thought of as a gamble. When you borrow it, how much you're borrowing and what the interest rate is. If you believe that you can use the money to make more than the interest, it's a good gamble. If you think, hey, if I buy this machine, I would be able to produce enough items that it would allow me to pay all the interest and then make more money than I would if I don't buy the machine at all. So the only reason that I ever answer, I mean, I'm not a financial advisor, but when people ask me, is this good debt, or should I borrow this money? Whether it's, I already have a company and it's in trouble and I need to bail it out, or what situation should I borrow money? The answer is always, do you believe that borrowing the money, in light of the fact that it's going to cost money to borrow it, do you believe you're going to be able to make more than the bank? Because the bank is going to make money when you borrow. You need, a bank knows, I have this money, I'm going to loan it to a person and I'm going to get 5%. Don't be the consumer. Don't be the person who borrows that money, pays the bank, and then eats the money. You need to take that money and then make 8% because you know that your profit margin in your business is 8%, so it justifies paying 5% interest on something. Other than that,
said at the top about the interest rates being the power move or the go-to move, right? You pencil it out.
Yeah, take the PPP stimulus program that was just kicked out, the boondoggle. I mean, this is one of the biggest fiscal. It frustrates me, and I'm on the receiving end of the PPP. But I mean,
and just to explain to people, the PPP is the payroll protection program, which small businesses can apply for a loan, which can be forgiven if that loan is spent on payroll.
Correct, and it's equal to 2.5 times your your average monthly, payroll, fully burdened payroll. So you're borrowing this money, and what they're after is getting people back to work. And so they look at it like if someone's on unemployment plus $600 a week, the government's paying that. So hey, we may as well put people, pay someone to put people back to work, so that at least they're paying payroll taxes on it. At least we're getting something out of it. But the problem is it's 2.5 times monthly payroll, but they're only allowing you to spend 75% of that. The rest of they're structuring it, and whatever's not forgiven gets rolled over into a 2-year ballooned 1% loan. Well, I'm good with that. AJ just struck on that. There's people who are really putting their foot on the gas right now in business who are like, well, I got to spend this. It's free payroll. Right. And I'm the other way around, where I'm like, if I end up, with a couple $100,000 with this at the finish line, I've got 2 years at 1%. That inflation outpaces that. So I mean,
yeah, you're never going to get a commercial loan at 1%.
Oh, fuck no. So I mean, I'm going to take this money and I'm going to invest it, and I've got 2 years to do with it what I can before I have to pay it back at one point, which is the free money, basically. So I mean, I'm going to go buy a building. I'm going to buy a piece of equipment. That's where the stimulation. I don't know.
But if you take that money and buy something that can't make you any money, for example, you spend it on a new garden in your backyard. That's, maybe it improves the value of your house a little bit, but it's not going to make you any money. You're just going to have
a neighborhood
debt.
kegger. Right?
That is not a good use of that money. Just so we don't gloss over it, Evan, I think, asked about what happens if we default. Mm-hmm. What happens if we default on that? I think a more plausible question would be, what if we just decide not to give any tax refunds this year as a country? What if we just decide to, to stop any government? What if we just shut down all the schools and say we're going to save money by not funding education anymore, period? Those things can't happen. It can't, not repaying those notes. The effects of that would be so big. Having the Fed as a bank go out of business would mean every single bank can't do business anymore. Because I think the easiest way to understand what it means to be the bank of banks is to look back at why we needed that. And if you were riding out west, 150 years ago, and you rode into some small town in Nevada and you needed to go to the bank, and the bank might have a sign on the door that says, closed, we're out of money this week. Well, to prevent that, the Fed was created so that no bank could ever be out of money. Every bank, if their vault in the back is secretly empty, they can still issue you paper checks because the Fed will back them up. They have credit at the Fed bank. So if the Fed bank goes out of business, every other bank, all the banks that we go to, can't issue money anymore. They'd be too scared. So the Fed bank failing to meet an obligation is just impossible. The idea of defaulting on T-bills is impossible.
It's actually impossible, or impossible like the mortgage bubble collapse in 2008 was impossible. Like
I'm gonna say actually impossible. It would be more practical to lay off all the military. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, could there be a day when somebody tries to go cash a T-bill and it doesn't? Somebody says no. I don't think that could ever happen. I think it practically speaking, it can't happen. I understand your question. It's a good question because there was a time when people said, oh, this could never happen and that could never happen in the banking world. But the Fed, the reliance on the Fed is too crucial to the entire system of money of banking.
There's actually sort of an analogy that historically of something like that happening, and it wasn't in the United States, it was actually in South America. But I don't know, for those of you who are old enough, I guess you might remember that back in the 1980s, there was something called the savings and loan crisis. And what the savings and loan crisis was another thing sort of like what happened back in 2008, where a bunch of banks went under. And what ended up happening was that the savings and loans in the United States had made large scale loans to governmental infrastructure or other projects in South America. And that became, I mean, they were able to get really good returns. I mean, like double-digit returns from governmental loans, which, I mean, you figure if you're loaning to a government of, one of the big world governments and you can get 12% interest, that's like, why wouldn't you do that, right? And so, well, you wouldn't do that because there's a reason why it has to be 12% to loan to a government, right? And so, in the end, they also got really favorable, the banks got favorable terms on all these loans, like they were instantly callable, basically. And what that means is that the banks could pretty much at any time just go demand their money from the government. And so countries like Brazil and Argentina and Chile and, had billions and billions and billions of dollars of these loans out there. And then some stuff had started happening with the economy in the United States. And so these banks suddenly needed cash. They needed to shore up their balance sheets. And so they went to these governments and said, hey, you have this loan from us, and we have a contract that says you have to pay it when we tell you to pay it. And we're telling you, you have to pay it now. You have to give us all the money back right now. And they did this sort of en masse, and so what did the governments do? Well, they didn't default per se. What they did was they went to their central banks and said, okay, print cruzeros, print lots of them.
Wow.
What would
exchange
happen
them, exchange them for dollars and pay off the loan? Well, what happens inside that country when all of a sudden the money supply goes from 100 million cruzeros to 400 billion cruzeros? Well,
what happens if we just stop, if everyone stops paying everything? What would happen if the system just stopped? If all the mortgage companies said you don't need to pay your mortgage, and you don't need to pay rent, and you don't need to pay your credit cards, and you don't need to pay foreign debt, like, what has this ever happened before?
Do you mean ever, or you mean like a pause, like someone proposed, like a
pause.
3-month pause?
Yeah.
Well, that's the question. That's what a lot of people propose. Like, and some places you're able to, like property taxes in my city, you're able to pause for a couple months. Other, rent, people will do that. And I don't know what happens on that interest. They're saying, like my credit card saying you can hold off paying for 3 months, but you still accrue interest, which is like, well, what's the point of holding off paying?
Right.
Well, so, mortgages are doing that too.
Some companies, it's easy to see. Like, for example, if Visa, right? Visa is a very big company. It has a lot of money. So if Visa wanted to just say, you know what, everybody who has a credit card with us, don't pay it back. Forget the fact that Visa is actually, the loans are actually with banks. But if Visa said, you don't have to pay us, and we have so much savings that we're going to pay our employees, so don't worry about that. Their employees could stay home, get paid, no problem. They're getting paid, not working. And if everybody else in the world said, okay, nobody is going to take any money for anything, that could be okay, except that everybody still wants to eat. Eating is the one thing that we can't shut off. We have to eat. Forget water. That's a little bit more complicated because of utilities, but we all want to eat. That means the farmers have to go to work. And why should the farmers go to work and produce food if nobody's paying them money for it? So that means some money has to change hands. Someone has to pay the farmer to kill his cow. Someone has to pay a butcher to cut it up. Someone has to pay the other farmer to mow the grain, and someone has to run the factory to turn the grain into bread. And if those people have to work for their money, why should other people be allowed to stay home and get money? And that problem, that everybody would rather do nothing and get all their stuff for free than have to work for it, creates creates a division, right? There's some people, we need some people for the good of the rest of us to go make food, right? We decided a long time ago that we want to live in cities where there's not enough room to everybody have their own garden and grow their own food. So if everybody had a garden in their own house and enough seeds and could grow their own food, then we wouldn't need the farmers, and the whole freezing the money thing would work. The reason we can't freeze the money is because we live in cities. Everyone in the country could freeze the money, but all the people in the city couldn't freeze the money because they have to have money trucked to them. So now we have to pay a trucker. We have to pay the plastic to package the food. We have to pay for the grocery store workers who are graciously, stocking the shelves. So if we're going to go to a no money, let's freeze all the money for 6 months, then what we're doing is going to a barter system. And what do city people have to give farmers? City people have nothing
jazz
to barter.
Hands.
You got to have a lot of jazz hands for a gallon of milk from a cow. And do you still want to be paying somebody at the FDA to pasteurize, to make sure it's pasteurized? I don't know.
Electrical work.
The system, Yeah, electrical work, the farmer would take the electrical work. So some people in the city could go out and do work for the farmer, but most people sitting in their condo or sitting in their apartment don't have anything to trade other than money in order to get food. So that would be the holdup.
I just want to make sure anyone who's joined, anyone can ask questions if you guys have them. Opening
Our
it up.
studio audience.
Yes.
I was going to ask, so I don't even know if my audio is working. I hope it is. I usually mute it and turn my video off for all of my work meetings because I do not like having to see myself on camera. But so I feel like this is a discussion about a lot of like these really, really big companies and really big industries. And a lot of the conversation, especially in 2008 and then again now, is about too big to fail. Like the idea that there's all these industries or companies that are too big to fail and that we need to give them part of this bailout or stimulus package. And from my perspective, like the biggest contributor to the economy is actually individual people that are buying and participating in all of this exchange of goods. So how come first of all, a group of companies or a type of industry is deemed too big to fail? And what does that mean? And how is it something that we can comprehend when there's so many people that are part of our economy that are contributing to the survival of our economy that aren't deemed a group large enough to not fail?
You know, it's interesting. I don't know a lot about that, but in preparation for this, I looked up where the government gets its money from, and because I was curious what the ratio was between, you know, individual income taxpayers and corporations. So out of our, you know, almost $4 trillion in revenue, we get $1.5 trillion comes from individual income taxes, and in comparison, 340 billion comes from corporations.
Oh.
So I mean, you know, then you get customs, excise, and you know other stuff. But I mean, that is very skewed. And I know when Trump took office, he gave corporate tax breaks, which cut that by about a third. So I mean, I don't know. It's too big to fail.
So I think the classic concept of too big to fail is that it's a single organization that's so large that if what it does and who its employs went away, that it would have a ripple effect across the economy to all these other companies and all these other employees and all these other things that would yield a really, really bad result. So that's the classic kind of thing. I think what's interesting, and this is opinion, not fact. This is just my opinion. So I'll preface it with that, is that we define too big to fail mostly on political terms and not necessarily on economic terms, right? So whether your organization, is too big to fail and therefore must have a government bailout or whatever it is really based on, how many political hands you greased in Washington, not necessarily on the reality of the situation, right? So
I think about and Marisa and I talked about this a little bit. So we have a huge bailout that went, not a lot of it, but a significant amount of money went to airlines, for example. And I don't know how it compares to, say, the healthcare industry, but it seems like the healthcare industry can use more. And it sort of makes sense to me. Okay, we need airplanes and we probably need military, and there's a lot of things I don't understand about what Boeing does and what the airline industry does. And if airlines went out of business or drastically reduced, then the cost of travel would probably go up. So there's some logic in my brain about it, but can you explain a little about why did the airlines get so much? And also what does it mean that they bought back their stocks, and why should we care about that?
I can.
Yeah, AJ.
I'll start with the talking about the airline. So the idea, like the media's term "too big to fail," is not necessarily the best term for why some industries or companies get bailouts. I think more importantly is too essential to the way the system works. And I'm not saying the system's good or bad. I'm just saying too essential to the system of the economy to fail. It's not about a certain size. It's not about big companies versus small companies. The fact is we don't have very many airplane manufacturing companies. There aren't very many. Boeing doesn't have a lot of competitors in this country. And even when you take the whole world, there's probably 10 companies like Boeing, and that's it, right? Boeing, as far as all of the commercial airlines in the world, I don't know what percentage of those planes are Boeing, but it's a big percentage. I bet it's somewhere in the 20% range, right? All of the major U.S. airlines, all of their fleet is 20% Boeing. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. I made up those numbers, but
even higher, probably. Yeah,
maybe higher. I don't know how many of them are Airbus or what, even what other companies there are, but it's a large number. It might be 50%. So if Boeing goes out of business, all of the airlines now have obsolete aircraft that can't get new parts. They can't get repairs. They can't call a customer service number when their plane, when they want to know what's that noise on the wing. There's no hotline to call because Boeing's out of business. So we can't let Boeing go out of business because of what it would do to the airline industry. We as a country decided at some point, I wasn't invited to that meeting, but someone decided that we want to have an airline industry, and not having Boeing would mean our airline industry is shut down. Right?
Until someone comes along and does better?
Yeah, but
barrier to entry to starting an airline.
Lower that interest rate. I'm close.
Yeah.
If you guys lower the interest rate.
He's been drinking.
That's true. I am all in favor of somebody trying to do better, but the problem is we are so reliant on that one industry, that one company right now. We can't let that company, we can't let Boeing go out of business. It's too detrimental. When we're not really talking about the Boeing employees, and we're not really talking about, you and I talked about this for a minute yesterday, we're not talking about the hundreds of thousands of vendors and suppliers and people who, the employees of the airlines and the employees of the food service and the employees of the airports. And we're not even talking about that. We're not talking about the direct impact of Boeing going out of business. We're talking about the indirect impact, the entire concept of having an operational airline industry would be so halted for a while. It wouldn't be forever, but it would be halted for a long time. And now maybe the problem is we only have, that is our reliance on one company for that. Why don't we have more people? Well, I don't know. There's probably a lot of reasons why there's not more competitors to Boeing. One of the reasons is they're pretty good at what they do, I think. But the concept too big to fail isn't really that Boeing's too big. It's that we as a country are too dependent on Boeing if we want an airline.
I just want to point out it's 4:30 if anyone does have to drop immediately. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep going for another 15, 20 minutes if you are.
Yeah, about 15.
Great. So one thing to note, I think it's kind of interesting, and we were talking at the very beginning of this before some other folks that were on about how the mingling of politics and economics, has just gotten so intertwined that it's almost
impossible. We solved everything before you guys joined. I don't know if I lost my notes. So.
Too big to fail for me is one of those concepts, once again, that it's that mingling of the politics and economics, where when you think about it, and this is something, business people are in business, and successful business people are in business either because they commit crimes or because they're smart, and sometimes both, right? But one thing in terms of smart is if you look at the political structure and what laws can actually be created in the United States and how those laws are created. If I am, I come up with a great idea and I start a business and it really actually does become pretty successful, and it's the first time that anybody's sort of gone into this industry sector or field, the best thing I can do with my profits is not invent a better product or put it into R&D and develop a better product. The best thing I can do is go buy congresspeople, right? Because then I can get whatever regulations, whatever laws I need to make sure nobody else ever comes into this industry.
What's funny, Troy? After the Deepwater Horizon accident, where it's like, well, why did millions of gallons spill out? I was shooting a shit with some friends, like, you know what? There's somebody out there who is on the verge of inventing an automatic oil underwater shutoff
system,
redundancies that do this. That is like, all right, now all they have to do is go and spend millions of dollars greasing Congress's pockets, and then a new federal law comes out. All oil dredgers on on U.S. soil must have this triple redundant shutoff valve effective in 12 months. And hey, by the way, I got one. It's already been listed. It's approved. It was written into the bill. It costs $10 million a piece, and there are 13,000 oil platforms that need them done. You go buy a congressman, and you get a law enacted that compels industry to use that. I see in the electrical industry where this new safety product comes out, arc fault circuit interrupters, and hey, this can save 1,000 lives a year by installing 4 of these $30 things in each home. And you're like, boy, somebody got this law pushed through. And the cynical part of me is exactly like that. I really wanted to go create a company that made underwater, quadruple redundant, oil shutoffs.
So as average people who can't buy congressmen or women, what can we do? What should we be?
You can do it at the local level.
What should we be thinking? Like, what can we? Sometimes it feels very like there's a bunch of puppets, and it feels like we don't really have a voice, and it feels like elections are manipulated. So what can we do? What can we look forward to?
You know how accessible city council people are? There's 3 seats up available right now. You know how many city council people will give you an audience if you write them a check?
Or even if you don't, like, I go talk to my city councilman all the time. He hangs out at, used to, when we were allowed to go to bars. But
Who was that? Who is it?
I don't live in Portland. I actually live in Tennessee.
Oh, got it. I'm sorry. But yeah.
Yeah, I do think that one of the interesting things, if historically, if you look at the last 40 years, the big party with the elephant and the big R, one of their successes has been the notion that they started at local political levels and just kept going and going and going and building from that point on.
Right. There's so many local offices that are open. Back probably 15 years ago now, I was involved with an effort on behalf of the Democratic Party to try to get people to realize you can basically sign a piece of paper and become a local elected official in 80% of the country. And that's what 5 years later, the Republicans really mobilized with money from the Kochs and the Mercers and people just funding people to go and sign the paper. The Democrats don't, they motivate via people's good intentions, not other ways. It's another Zoom call. But yeah, you can get involved. I mean, it's a slow process, but now you look at what's happened. Once you're at a low level, you just sort of move up, you fill in the ranks above as things get empty, and you start throwing up roadblocks. And then you're the chair of the local committee on water use. And it's, if you really want to be involved, think local, tweet national.
And play the long game.
Jocelyn,
but that doesn't help us right now.
The one thing that we all agree is valuable and we don't want to give is time. And that's the thing we all have an equal amount of. Even rich people have the same amount of time. And just like these guys are saying, it's about spending time. What can we all do? Go spend some time. Go make yourself the assistant treasurer of the library. Whatever it takes. if you want to make a difference, you have to be out there spending your time. It's not about writing an email once a week. It's about having your face and your time out there so that other people see, oh, I agree with that person. Those people, the Republicans are really good at it. Democrats aren't so good at it because of, intentional policies created by people. And so these guys are absolutely right. It's about being willing to go spend time, being willing to go get involved. And when you think about, the president of your HOA in your condo association is so annoying and has so much power because they have the time to spend to ruin everybody else's experience, right? So those kind of things happen because those people have time. And an aggregate of that has a massive, massive effect. And like Choi said, it's a long game. It takes a long time.
Whatever the other side accuses you of doing, voter fraud, AstroTurf, which is like paying for grassroots movement, anything like that is what they're actually doing. I mean, the Tea Party, the protest yesterday in where was it, Michigan somewhere?
Minnesota or Michigan,
yeah. People, like, who are those people? They're people that can afford to spend the day going out, right? And like just doing that. Like I'm going to be calm. Luckily, one of my projects has ended, so I've got time to go back to my days of ranting lunatic. So I look forward to this.
So one of the interesting things from my perspective too is that if you do the sports analogy, of football or baseball or anything else, if you win the World Series or you win the Super Bowl or whatever, that team isn't the team that gets the first pick in the next year's draft, right? They understand that for fairness and for all these other reasons, you should reverse things, right? So the worst team gets the first pick, that kind of stuff. In our country, on the political world, if you win the election, you get to make the laws governing the next election. So guess what that's going to do?
Especially
make us all Wisconsin.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there is something weird about that.
So we should all go run for something, and eventually we'll get health care.
Yeah.
So I work in health.
You end up with the people on, like right now, the people on Portland City Council are I don't know. I hear that there. I can think of 10 people just off the top of my head. Half the people on this call are more qualified than half the city council people. The mayor is, a very smart guy. But I mean, Chloe Udele was ushered into office because Steve Novick was taxing everybody. Chloe Udele is an idiot. She ran a $60,000 a year bookstore, and she was running out of business. I mean, she doesn't have it, and now she's talking about $400 million policies. Yeah.
Well, going into bankruptcy is a ticket to presidency.
As it is. So I know that we're out of time, and Jocelyn, I just wanted to put this out there because someone brought up the idea of like what's deemed as big business is a political decision. And I wanted to kind of get an answer of something that's really been bothering me, which is the Fed reduced its interest rates to 0 prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm curious to understand, because economics is so far out of my purview. I work in information security for healthcare. Like, what is the ripple effect? And like, how are we now handcuffed to be able to adequately respond to a financial crisis created by a public health crisis because the Fed had already dropped the interest rate so low? Like, how did that kind of fuck us? Like, for lack of a more eloquent way of saying that, because that was pretty alarming, especially with how rapidly it occurred.
Yeah. So the Fed does have a lot of different tools at its disposal. That's one, right? The interest rate, and they actually have multiple interest rates that they can manipulate, and so they manipulated one of them. They also have all sorts of other things. They have these things called open market operations, and all sorts of other tools. So it isn't quite as drastic as it might seem from what the headlines were about. Oh my God, they dropped interest rates to zero. They dropped a particular interest rate to zero.
Except that Trump was pushing to push it to negative.
Oh yeah, but he's an idiot, and so he,
But also, the Fed arguably dropped their interest rates to zero because of political pressure.
There may be some political pressure there. The ideal around the Fed is, even if they have congressional approval to be members of the Fed board of governors, that they're supposed to act outside of that political pressure, which I don't know whether that's the ideal, right? But I think the way that they would justify it is that they already saw an economy that was starting to sputter pre-COVID, that was independent of all the COVID things, and they did what they thought would be rational given what they saw.
That seems like a really great benefit of the doubt that you're willing to give them.
Yeah.
I'm
not saying I give it to them. I'm just saying that's what they would say.
Yeah.
And humans are pretty bad at being rational, right?
Yeah.
Well, and I'm sorry, Jocelyn, because I think that you were ending on a note of like, what can we do to actually feel like we have a semblance of control, which is an important element of a lot of these conversations. And so
on that, I would say one broad thing that we can all do is to conserve and wisely spend our mental energy. That we can get caught up in arguing, whether you're a Twitter person and you're arguing with a bot or someone with a few people, or we have limited cognitive load right now, and it's invisibly being crushed by stress and uncertainty. And whatever we do, like make wise decisions with your time and energy in the next few weeks and months, and try to make the best choices you can for where you put that.
Get a bidet.
Sure.
Get a bidet.
I don't know, man.
I'm gonna say something just because I'm probably the most. Well, I don't know. I'll just get off that. The one thing that I think that, because I live in Portland, and Portland is an extremely liberal place, but I have a lot of family that are very, very conservative, and so I spend a lot of time listening to people bash conservative people, Trump supporters, and I don't hear a lot of time. I don't see a lot of liberal people reaching out to Trump supporters and saying, "Hey, we have spare time. Can you just tell me like everything about what you believe and why? And I just want to understand you." I know that sounds crazy, because the general consensus of most educated people is the Trump supporters are crazy and they don't know what they're talking about and they have really bad ideas and they're just religious zealots or whatever. But if you call and ask them what they're thinking and try to have a rational conversation with them and understand where they're coming from, they might not seem as crazy. Some of them might, but even if you want to treat them as your enemy, understanding your enemy is a really great way to be more prepared in battle. That's sort of a paraphrase from The Art of War. So now is a good time, because everybody has spare time to try and understand what everybody else is thinking, rather than getting into arguments. Just listen. Listen to the side you don't usually listen to.
AJ quotes Sun Tzu to end the conversation. Come on, man.
Oh! MPW.
Shit. All right. Well, thanks for organizing. I got to jump and go make dinner.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
All right, this was
experiment.
Cool. Choi, that was awesome. Thanks, man.
That's fun, guys. Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Good night. Bye.
What are you doing?
As we
Actually.
keep typing.
Okay, bye.